She accused him of forcing his child to work, until one look into his daughter's eyes revealed a truth that changed everything. The cafe opened before the sun fully rose, when the street outside was still quiet and the city seemed to be holding its breath. The lights inside flickered on one by one, casting a warm yellow glow over worn wooden tables and a counter that had seen better days. Ethan Miller stood behind it in a white t-shirt and a red apron, tying the strings at his waist with practiced movements. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad, but the fatigue in his blue eyes betrayed how little rest he had allowed himself. Mornings were always the hardest, not because of the work, but because they reminded him how much depended on him now. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room as he checked the pastry display, adjusting a tray that leaned slightly to the left. Everything had to look right. He knew most customers came here not for luxury, but for comfort, and he tried to give them at least that. As he wiped his hands on the apron, he glanced toward the small table near the window where Sophie stood on tiptoe, carefully folding napkins she could barely reach. Her white dress looked almost too clean for the cafe, its fabric soft and bright against the darker tones of the room. A few strands of her blonde hair had slipped loose from the clip he'd fixed earlier, framing her small, serious face. "Sweetheart, you don't have to do that," Ethan said gently, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry. Sophie shook her head without looking up, concentrating on her task with determination that felt far too grown-up for a 6-year-old. "I like helping," she said. "And I want to stay with you." The word settled heavily in his chest. He hadn't asked her to help. He had never wanted this for her. But leaving her alone at home wasn't an option, and trusting strangers had become something he no longer knew how to do. The bell above the door chimed softly as the first customer entered, followed soon by another. Ethan moved into motion, greeting them with a polite smile, pouring coffee, taking orders. Sophie stepped back instinctively, making herself small the way she had learned to do, watching her father from a distance. Every few minutes, Ethan checked on her with his eyes alone, a silent reassurance that he was still there. The cafe hummed with quiet life now, the low murmur of voices and the clink of cups creating a fragile sense of normalcy. From the outside, it might have looked wrong. A child in a cafe during working hours. A man who couldn't afford childcare. A life balanced on the edge of survival. But inside that space, there was something else entirely. There was care in the way Ethan watched Sophie, and trust in the way Sophie stayed close to him. There was love woven into every small, imperfect moment. Neither of them noticed the sleek black car slowing to a stop outside, nor the woman inside studying the cafe with a critical gaze. They didn't see the door open again, didn't feel the shift in the air as someone new stepped inside. For now, the world was just a father, a daughter, and a quiet morning that felt almost peaceful. They had no idea that this peace was about to be shattered, or that the truth behind their life was about to be questioned by someone who believed she already knew everything. The woman who entered the cafe did not blend in. Her presence cut through the soft morning atmosphere like a sharp line drawn across glass. Victoria Hale stepped inside with measured confidence, her blue dress perfectly pressed, her posture elegant and unyielding. She paused just past the doorway, taking in the room with a glance that missed nothing: the worn chairs, the modest counter, the quiet customers nursing their coffee. This was not a place she was used to standing in, and it showed in the way her eyes narrowed slightly, already judging. Ethan noticed her immediately, not because she was loud, but because people like her carried a different kind of silence. He straightened instinctively and offered the same polite smile he gave everyone. "Good morning," he said, reaching for a cup. Victoria did not answer at once. Her gaze had moved past him, fixing on Sophie near the window. The child had just finished folding napkins and was now lining them up carefully, her small fingers precise, her face focused. Victoria's expression hardened. She took a step closer, heels clicking softly against the floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cool and controlled, "is that your daughter?" Ethan followed her gaze, a knot forming in his stomach. Yes, he replied cautiously. That's Sophie. Victoria looked back at him, disbelief flickering across her features. And why, she asked slowly, is a 6-year-old working in your cafe? The word working landed like a slap. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again, choosing his words carefully. She's not working, he said quietly. She's just keeping me company. Victoria's eyes narrowed further as she glanced back at Sophie, who had frozen now, sensing the tension even without understanding it. Keeping you company? Victoria repeated. She's handling supplies. She's on her feet. This doesn't look like play. A few customers glanced over, curiosity stirring. Ethan felt heat rise to his face, a familiar mix of shame and defensiveness. She wants to help, he said. I don't make her do anything. Victoria crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. Children don't belong in workplaces like this, she said sharply. Especially not when they're being used to support a business. Sophie took a small step toward her father, her white dress brushing against his leg. She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide, confused, and a little afraid. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder without thinking, grounding both of them. It's okay, he murmured to her, though he wasn't sure it was. Victoria exhaled sharply, clearly unconvinced. I've seen this before, she said, her tone edged with anger. Parents who justify exploitation by calling it help. Do you have any idea how serious this is? Ethan's heart began to pound. He did know. He knew too well. His voice dropped, rough with restraint. You don't know our situation, he said. And you don't get to decide what kind of father I am based on 5 minutes in my cafe. Victoria's eyes flashed. If a child is being put in a position she shouldn't be in, it absolutely becomes my concern, she replied. I could call social services right now. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Sophie's fingers tightened in the fabric of Ethan's apron. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, every sound suddenly too loud, every breath too shallow. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm, even as memories of forms, questions, and cold offices rushed back into his mind. Please, he said quietly, meeting Victoria's gaze without backing down. Before you do anything, before you judge us, at least listen. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She glanced once more at Sophie, then back at Ethan, her lips pressed into a thin line. The certainty she had walked in with wavered, just slightly, though she did not yet realize it. Fine, she said at last. Explain. And with that single word, the fragile balance of Ethan's life tipped, pulling the truth closer to the surface than it had ever been before. Ethan felt every pair of eyes in the cafe settle on him as Victoria waited, her arms still crossed, her posture rigid with expectation. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, because he knew that once he started speaking, there would be no going back. The truth was not something he shared easily. It was heavy, personal, and often misunderstood. Sophie remained pressed against his side, her small hand gripping the edge of his apron as if it were the only solid thing in the room. My wife died 3 years ago, Ethan began quietly. The words felt rough in his throat, even now. He did not look at Victoria when he said it, but at the counter in front of him, at the small crack in the wood he had never bothered to fix. Cancer. We spent everything trying to save her. Insurance ran out long before hope did. His voice remained controlled, but beneath it ran a deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could ever touch. Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, though she said nothing. Ethan continued, because stopping would only make it harder. After she was gone, it was just me and Sophie. No family nearby. No one to help. I took whatever work I could find, and when that wasn't enough, I opened this place. He gestured around the cafe, not with pride, but with quiet honesty. This cafe is the reason we still have a roof over our heads. Sophie looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face, as if checking whether he was all right. He gave her a small nod, reassuring her without words. I can't afford childcare, he said plainly. And I won't leave her alone. So she stays with me. She sits. She draws. Sometimes she helps because she wants to feel useful, because she hates being told she's a burden. His voice tightened at the last word, and he forced himself to keep going. I never asked her to work, he said, finally meeting Victoria's gaze. I ask her to be safe. I ask her to stay close. That's it. The cafe was completely silent now. Even the customers who had pretended not to listen were frozen in place. Sophie shifted slightly, then spoke, her voice small but clear. I like being here, she said. Papa doesn't make me do anything. I just don't want him to be alone. The simplicity of her words cut deeper than any explanation Ethan could have given. Victoria looked at the child then, really looked at her. Not as a problem to be solved or a rule being broken, but as a little girl standing too close to responsibility. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, something like doubt flickered across her face. Children shouldn't have to worry about adults being alone, she said, more quietly than before. They shouldn't, Ethan agreed. But sometimes they do anyway. A long pause stretched between them. Victoria uncrossed her arms, then folded them again, as if unsure what to do with her own reaction. And you expect me to believe that this is all temporary, she said. That this doesn't become her life. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, he replied. I expect you to believe that I'm doing the best I can with what I have. And that every choice I make is for her. Sophie leaned fully into him now, resting her head against his side. He placed a gentle hand on her hair, his touch instinctive and protective. Victoria watched this, her eyes following the movement closely, and something in her expression softened, just enough to be noticeable. She turned slightly toward the window, as if needing distance to think. You should know, she said after a moment, that from the outside, this looks bad. Ethan nodded. I know, he said. It always does. He hesitated, then added quietly, but the outside never tells the whole story. Victoria looked back at him, her gaze no longer sharp, but conflicted. She had come in ready to accuse, ready to intervene, certain of her moral ground. Now that certainty was cracking, and she did not yet know what would replace it. The cafe, once just another building on a list, had become something else entirely. And for the first time since she walked in, Victoria Hale was no longer sure she was right. Victoria stepped a little farther into the cafe, as if the space itself now demanded her full attention. The anger that had sharpened her voice earlier was no longer there, replaced by something heavier and far less comfortable. She looked around again, but this time her eyes lingered on different details. She noticed the way the chairs were repaired with care rather than replaced, the handwritten menu taped slightly crooked behind the counter, the faint crayon marks near the window where Sophie stood. These were not signs of neglect. They were signs of survival. She exhaled slowly and turned back to Ethan. You said she chooses to help, Victoria said, her voice controlled but quieter than before. Does she ever feel like she has to? The question landed differently from the others. It wasn't an accusation. It was genuine concern. Ethan considered it carefully before answering. She feels responsible for me, he admitted. I wish she didn't. I remind her every day that being a kid is enough. But when you lose someone you love, you grow up faster, whether you want to or not. Sophie looked between them, sensing the shift in tone. Papa tells me stories when it's slow, she said suddenly, eager to explain herself. And I draw pictures. I don't stay all day. I just like being here because I can see him. Her voice was soft, but it carried a certainty that could not be mistaken for rehearsed obedience. Ethan felt his chest tighten again, this time with a quiet ache. Victoria crouched slightly, lowering herself closer to Sophie's height without fully kneeling. "Do you go to school?" she asked gently. Sophie nodded. "Yes. I like reading. And my teacher says I'm good at math." A small smile tugged at her lips, proud and hopeful. Victoria returned the smile, faint and hesitant, then stood again. The cafe door opened and closed as a customer left, breaking the moment. Victoria straightened, smoothing the fabric of her dress, as if reminding herself who she was supposed to be. "I need to understand something," she said to Ethan. "If someone reported this, what would happen?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "They would investigate," he said. "They'd ask questions. They'd decide whether I'm fit. And even if they found nothing wrong, the process itself would scare her. It would remind her that nothing in our life is stable." Victoria absorbed this in silence. She had signed off on investigations before, had believed in systems and procedures because they looked clean on paper. But standing here, she could see the cost of those processes more clearly than she ever had. Her gaze drifted back to Sophie, who was now absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the counter with her finger. "I lost my parents when I was young," Victoria said suddenly, the admission slipping out before she seemed ready for it. Ethan looked at her in surprise. "I had money," she continued, her voice distant. "People. Structure. Everything that was supposed to make it easier. But I was alone in a house that echoed." She stopped herself, lips pressing together, as if regretting the vulnerability. Ethan didn't respond right away. When he did, it was quiet and steady. "I'm sorry," he said. "No child should feel alone like that." Victoria met his eyes, something raw flickering there before she masked it. "That's why this bothers me," she said. "Because I see a child too close to adult problems. And I don't know whether to step in or step back." Sophie took a hesitant step forward, looking up at Victoria with open curiosity. "I'm not alone," she said simply. "I have my papa." The words hung in the air, uncomplicated and true. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The rigid certainty she had walked in with was gone. In its place was a difficult question she had not expected to face. For the first time, she was no longer sure that intervention was the right answer. And in that uncertainty, the possibility of something kinder began to form. Victoria remained standing in the center of the cafe, her gaze moving slowly between Ethan and Sophie as if she were seeing them both for the first time. The certainty that had driven her anger earlier had dissolved into something far more unsettling. She had come prepared to confront, to accuse, to fix what she assumed was broken. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of a life that was fragile but deeply intentional, held together not by neglect or cruelty, but by devotion. She turned to Ethan, her voice measured but no longer sharp. "Do you have help at all?" she asked. "Friends, relatives, anyone who can take Sophie sometimes?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not anymore," he replied. "Most people drift away when things get complicated. I don't blame them. Everyone has their own lives." He didn't sound bitter when he said it, only tired. Victoria nodded, absorbing the answer with a heaviness that showed she understood more than she wanted to admit. Sophie wandered back to her small table by the window and picked up a crayon, beginning to draw as if the conversation no longer frightened her. Ethan watched her for a moment, making sure she was settled, then turned back to Victoria. "I know how this looks," he said quietly. "If there were another option, I would take it. I would give her everything she deserves without her ever seeing how hard it is." His voice faltered just slightly. "But this is what I have. And I won't be ashamed of trying to protect my daughter." Victoria folded her hands in front of her, the expensive rings on her fingers catching the light. You're right about one thing, she said slowly. From the outside, it looks wrong. But the outside doesn't feel the weight of it. She paused, then added, I came here ready to call someone. Ready to make a report. Ethan's shoulders stiffened, though he said nothing. I'm glad I didn't, she finished, her voice firm with decision. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not relief exactly, but a loosening of something tight and painful in his chest. Thank you, he said, not out of obligation, but with genuine sincerity. Victoria waved the thanks away with a small motion of her hand. Don't thank me yet, she replied. There are still things that worry me. She glanced around the cafe once more, this time not as an inspector, but as someone imagining possibilities. This place could work, she said thoughtfully. But it can't all rest on you. And certainly not on her. Ethan frowned slightly, unsure where she was going. I'm not here to take anything away from you, Victoria continued. But I don't believe the answer is pretending this situation is sustainable forever. Sophie looked up from her drawing, sensing the seriousness in the air. Are we in trouble? She asked quietly. Ethan started toward her, but Victoria reached her first, kneeling fully this time so they were eye to eye. No, she said gently. You're not in trouble at all. Sophie studied her face carefully, then nodded, accepting the reassurance. Victoria stood again, brushing imaginary dust from her dress. I need time, she said to Ethan. Time to look into things properly. Not as an investor, not as someone passing judgment, but as someone who doesn't want to walk away and pretend she didn't see this. Ethan met her gaze, cautious but open. All I ask, he said, is that whatever you decide, you remember she's a child. And I'm her father. Victoria nodded once, firmly. I won't forget that. As she turned toward the door, the tension in the cafe shifted once more, this time into something uncertain but hopeful. Ethan watched her leave, unsure whether her presence had made things better or worse. But as Sophie returned to her drawing, humming softly under her breath, he allowed himself to believe that sometimes, being seen did not mean being destroyed. Sometimes, it meant being understood. The cafe felt unusually quiet after Victoria left, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan moved through the rest of the morning on instinct, serving customers, washing cups, wiping counters, his body performing familiar motions while his mind replayed every word of the conversation. He kept expecting the door to open again, expecting uniforms or official voices, expecting consequences. Each time the bell rang, his heart jumped before he forced himself to breathe and continue. Sophie sensed his tension even though he tried to hide it. She stayed close without being asked, sitting at her table and drawing pictures of the cafe with oversized windows and smiling stick figures. Occasionally she would glance up at him, and when their eyes met, she smiled reassuringly, as if reminding him that she was still there and that nothing terrible had happened yet. The quiet strength in her small gestures made his chest ache. By midday, the usual rush had passed. Ethan closed the cafe for a short break, locking the door and pulling down the shade halfway. He made Sophie a sandwich and sat across from her, watching as she ate slowly, her legs swinging under the chair. Are you mad at me? She asked suddenly, her voice small but serious. The question hit him harder than anything Victoria had said. Mad at you, he repeated softly. Never. Why would you think that? Sophie shrugged. Because I helped. And the lady got angry. Ethan reached across the table and took her hands in his. Listen to me, he said gently. You didn't do anything wrong. Not helping, not being here, not being you. Sophie studied his face carefully, as if checking for lies, then nodded and returned to her sandwich. The knot in his chest loosened slightly. That afternoon, Ethan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. His stomach tightened as he answered. It was Victoria. Her voice was calm, stripped of the sharpness from earlier. She said she had spent the past few hours reviewing documents, checking regulations, and speaking to people who worked with family-owned businesses. Everything you're doing is legal, she said. But legality isn't the same as safety, and it isn't the same as support. Ethan leaned against the counter, listening. Victoria explained that she had owned buildings and businesses for years, that she had seen too many families collapse under the weight of doing everything alone. I don't want to be another person who walks away because it's uncomfortable, she said. And I don't want to be someone who reports a problem without offering a solution. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, unsure what to feel. Cautious hope, mixed with fear, washed through him. She asked if she could return the next day to talk, properly this time. Not in anger. Not as an accusation. Ethan hesitated, then agreed. When he hung up, Sophie was watching him intently. Was that the lady? She asked. He nodded. Is she mad? Ethan smiled faintly. No, he said. I think she's thinking. That evening, after closing the cafe for good, Ethan and Sophie walked home hand in hand. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows on the pavement. Sophie skipped ahead, then waited for him, her white dress glowing softly in the dim light. Do you think everything will be okay? She asked. Ethan squeezed her hand. I don't know, he answered honestly. But I know we'll face it together. Later, as Sophie slept curled beneath her blanket, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, staring at nothing. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than fear pressing against his ribs. It wasn't relief yet, and it wasn't certainty. It was possibility. Fragile, unexpected, and terrifying in its own way. And as he finally turned off the light, he allowed himself to believe that maybe being seen did not have to end in loss. Maybe, just maybe, it could lead to help. Victoria returned the next morning without the sharp edge that had defined her before. She entered the cafe quietly, dressed more simply this time, though there was still no mistaking who she was. Ethan noticed immediately that she paused near the door, giving the room a moment to breathe before stepping fully inside. That small gesture eased something in him. It felt like respect. Sophie was sitting at her table by the window, coloring with intense focus. When she looked up and saw Victoria, she froze for a moment, then gave a shy nod. Victoria returned it with a gentle smile that looked unfamiliar on her face, as if it had not been used often. Ethan approached cautiously, drying his hands on his apron. You said you wanted to talk, he said. Victoria nodded. Yes. And I want to be clear about something first. I'm not here to threaten you. And I'm not here to take anything away from you. They sat at one of the empty tables, sunlight spilling across the surface between them. Victoria folded her hands, then unfolded them again, clearly choosing her words carefully. I spent last night thinking about what I saw, she said. Not just the situation, but the way you look at your daughter. That isn't the look of a man who uses his child. It's the look of someone who's terrified of failing her. Ethan felt a quiet ache behind his eyes but said nothing. Victoria continued. You're carrying everything alone. That's not sustainable, and it's not fair to either of you. But reporting you wouldn't fix that. It would just break what little stability you've managed to build. She glanced toward Sophie, who was now pretending very hard not to listen. I don't want to be part of something that hurts a child. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. Then what do you want to be part of? Victoria met his gaze. I want to help, she said simply. The word hung between them, fragile and unbelievable. Ethan let out a small, incredulous laugh before he could stop himself. Help, he repeated. Most people say that and mean advice. Or pity. Victoria shook her head. I mean support, she replied. Real support. The kind that doesn't disappear when things get complicated. She explained her proposal slowly. She wanted to invest in the cafe, not as an owner who dictated terms, but as a silent partner. She would cover the cost of renovations, help hire additional staff, and ensure Ethan could work normal hours. In return, she wanted the cafe to remain what it already was, a place of warmth, not exploitation. She wanted Sophie to be free to be a child, not a fixture behind the counter. Ethan listened, stunned. "Why?" he asked quietly. Victoria hesitated. "Because someone once saw me as a problem instead of a person," she said. "And I promised myself I wouldn't do that to someone else if I had a choice." Sophie approached them slowly, her drawing held tightly in her hands. "Are you leaving again?" she asked Victoria, her voice careful. Victoria knelt in front of her without hesitation. "No," she said gently. "I'm staying. And I want to make sure you don't have to worry so much anymore." Sophie studied her face for a long moment, then offered her the drawing. It showed the cafe with 3 figures inside, all smiling. Victoria accepted it with surprising care. Ethan felt something shift deep inside his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't just reacting to danger. He was being offered a future. Not one built on fear or exhaustion, but on the possibility of balance. As Victoria stood to leave, she paused by the door. "Think about it," she said. "You don't have to decide today." Ethan nodded slowly. "I will," he said. And as the bell chimed behind her, he realized that hope no longer felt like a dangerous thing. It felt like an invitation. The cafe reopened 2 weeks later, but it felt like an entirely different place, even though its soul remained the same. Fresh paint brightened the walls, the lighting was softer, and new tables filled the space without crowding it. There was a small corner near the window now, carefully arranged with books, crayons, and cushions, a space clearly meant for children and clearly separate from work. Ethan stood behind the counter in his white t-shirt and red apron, taking a moment to breathe it all in. He had agreed to Victoria's offer after many long conversations and even longer nights of doubt. Saying yes had been terrifying. But saying no would have meant staying trapped in fear. Sophie ran ahead of him as the door opened, her laughter light and unguarded. She stopped in the children's corner, sank onto the cushions, and immediately began flipping through a picture book. She did not look back to see if anyone was watching her. That alone told Ethan everything. The weight he had carried for so long loosened in his chest, replaced by something warmer, steadier. Relief, maybe. Or gratitude. Victoria arrived later that morning, not with an entourage or announcements, but quietly, like any other customer. She ordered coffee and waited in line, watching the cafe fill with familiar faces and new ones alike. When she reached the counter, she met Ethan's eyes and smiled. "You did this," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "We did," he replied. She nodded, accepting the correction. Throughout the day, Ethan noticed small changes that mattered more than any renovation. He no longer checked the door in panic when it opened. He no longer rushed every task as if time itself were an enemy. He could look over at Sophie and see her as she was meant to be seen, not as a silent helper or a worried shadow, but as a child fully absorbed in her own world. Every now and then she would glance up, catch his eye, and grin, and he would grin back without fear of what that moment cost him. In the afternoon, Victoria joined them at a table, holding Sophie's drawing from before, now carefully flattened and protected in a clear sleeve. "I kept it," she said simply. Sophie beamed. "It's our cafe," she said proudly. Victoria nodded. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." As the day wound down and the sun dipped low, casting long golden lines across the floor, Ethan locked the door and leaned against it for a moment. The cafe was quiet again, but this time the silence was peaceful, not heavy. Sophie came over and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against him. "You're smiling," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "I just realized something," he replied. "What?" she asked. He looked around the cafe, then down at her. "That we're going to be okay." Victoria stood nearby, watching them with a thoughtful expression. She did not speak, and she did not need to. The truth was there in front of all of them, unspoken and undeniable. Care did not always look the way people expected. Sometimes it looked messy. Sometimes it looked like a child folding napkins or a father wearing exhaustion like a second skin. But when someone chose to see the whole story, not just the part that fit their assumptions, something remarkable could happen. As they stepped outside together and locked up for the night, the cafe lights glowing warmly behind them, Ethan felt a sense of closure settle in. The accusation that had once threatened to tear his world apart had become the beginning of something better. Not because he had been rescued, but because he had been understood. And in that understanding, a new chapter of their lives had quietly, beautifully begun.